right, so what we're going to do is I'm going to give you all a little bit of tutorial on consumer and producer surplus, as well as tax incidence and deadweight loss. And the reason I'm doing this is because I had a couple of questions about your Chapter 5 homework, and so I just want to go over it a little bit with you. All right, so first of all, let's see if we can, let's ignore this supply curve, okay? The reason we're going to ignore that supply curve is because in question 6, we're being asked about consumer surplus before the tax. And so what this graph is showing us is the before and the after. The after the tax is the second supply curve. All right, so we're going to ignore that for now. Now, the idea of consumer surplus is it's the amount of, I don't know, a good deal consumers are getting. Okay, so if you're willing to pay $2 for something, but you can get it for $1, your consumer surplus was $1. Okay, it's the difference between the $2 that you're willing to pay and the $1 that you actually do pay. All right, so if you look at our demand curve, you have points all along the demand curve above the equilibrium price where consumers that are willing to pay more than the equilibrium price are represented. So the idea of consumer surplus is that it is the area of this graph that is above the equilibrium price but below the demand curve. Okay, so for example, whoops, went a little crazy there. So for example, you have this whole area right here. Okay, that area, if you can see it, is your area of consumer surplus. So the answer is A and B and E. All right, hopefully that helped a little bit maybe. Let's erase that for a second though and talk a little more about the tax, because we're going to need to be discussing the tax in a second. All right, so let's pretend for a second, I'm just going to make these numbers up. The tax is $1 and it is on a 6-pack of beer. All right, the new price that consumers have to pay is going to be $8. All right, so if consumers are paying $8 and the tax is $1, how much are producers being paid? Well, we're going to say they're being paid $7. Okay, so 7 plus $1 is the $8 that consumers are paying. All right, now producers are not receiving $8. Okay, and our second supply curve is really just there to tell us what, I guess to kind of give us what the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price are. Okay, and that turns out to be the equilibrium price and quantity that consumers are paying. Okay, that's right here. But the reality is that suppliers are not supplying a whole lot, and they're not receiving the $8. They're receiving $7. And so the quantity that they're supplying is the second dot here. I don't want to label it, but basically that's our Q1. All right, so the second supply curve really just details what the tax is doing to the market. Okay, and in order to make it make sense, we go ahead and shift the supply curve to the left, and that demonstrates to us the new equilibrium price and quantity. All right, just be aware that that's not the price that producers are receiving, because $1 of that goes to tax. Okay, so that's kind of where we are. When we look at deadweight loss in a second, that's basically what's going on. It used to be that was our quantity that was at equilibrium, but when you added the tax, the quantity is decreased. Well, that decrease in quantity times the price is going to be our deadweight loss in a second. All right, so let's move on. We're going to look at a producer surplus now. Okay, question 7 says, look at the provided figure. What areas represent producer surplus before the tax? So again, ignore the second supply curve. Okay, so producer surplus is defined as the area on the graph that is below the price but above the supply curve. So now we have producer surplus is this area, which is C, F, and D. C, D, F. All right? So if you combine that, it's basically with this graph, because of the linear nature of these curves, The producer surplus and the consumer surplus are equal. Okay? Consumer was A, B, and E. Producer surplus is C, D, and F. All right, question 8. It says, look at the provided figure. What areas represent consumer surplus after the tax? Okay, so now consumers are paying $8. Remember, we said the 6-pack of beer is now $8. Used to be $7. The difference is the $1 tax. So at $8, we have this is our price. Everything above the price but below the demand curve is consumer surplus. So area A is going to be our consumer surplus. Then we roll on to question 9, and it's asking us about producer surplus after the tax. Okay, so after the tax, let's see, this is where it gets a little more tricky. Okay, it's still simple, but it's still, this part can be confusing. All right, so the second supply curve is not actually what producers are supplying. Okay, they're still supplying the first supply curve. All right, and so the price they're receiving is $7. Well, everything under $7 but above the supply curve is going to be the producer surplus. So it's this area here. All right, so D is the producer surplus. This is the part that got tricky. Okay, the second supply curve did tell us what the new equilibrium there tells us what the consumers are paying, $8. And so we did use that price to figure out our consumer surplus. But we have to use the price that producers are receiving to calculate the producer surplus. All right? And it honestly, let me erase this for a second. It honestly doesn't make sense to say that's the amount that is being supplied at $7, because they're obviously supplying something, right? So we're going to say this is the price and quantity that producers are willing and able to supply at that price of $7. So everything below $7 and above the supply curve is going to be our producer surplus. I agree that one's a little bit tricky. All right, question 10. Look at the provided figure. What areas represent the tax revenue after the tax? All right, well, this one's pretty straightforward, okay? So we got the $1 tax. We have, this is our new equilibrium, okay? That means the quantity is right here, all right? So that quantity times the tax, which is the $1. So basically this and this and this, that rectangle that is B and C is going to be our tax revenue. Okay, so B and C. Special note here, the tax revenue actually comes from, it's taken from the producer and the consumer surplus. Okay, that's where the tax revenue comes from. Now, we're about to talk about this little area here, E and F. That's going to be our deadweight loss. All right, so moving on, question 11. What areas represent the deadweight loss after the tax? So here's what happens, all right? We've got, let me just circle up here, outline our consumer surplus, okay? And then right here, we've got our producer surplus, okay? So let me just note those. Then, let me change color on this. We have this area here that is the tax revenue. All right. And then what we have left is this little triangle. This triangle here is our deadweight loss. Now the reason that's our deadweight loss is because prior to the tax revenue, or the tax, okay, B and E were both part of the consumer surplus. All right. Now they've been taken away because of the tax. All right. C and F were part of the producer surplus. Again, those have been taken away because of the tax. Now, B and C are not lost to society because that's tax revenue that the governing entity is going to use for some social good. All right. But the producer surplus in the consumer surplus that used to be E and F, those are totally lost. Nothing comes of that. All right? Society's not gaining anything there. It's considered loss. Okay? And so that little triangle is considered our deadweight loss. E and F. Now, hopefully this helped. If it didn't, if it added more questions, please let me know and I will try to answer those as quickly as I can. Thanks.